So how big are they? So let's take a look at them. Starting with the upper bow. And I'll leave the greater Bragg Creek circling crops. So our crops, which are the largest footprint we have, occur at the lower part of the basin, and they've essentially replaced native grassland over the decades. Pastures for our livestock. So again, crops, pastures, our cut blocks. And again, if you look at this, you need to remind yourself that if you're an FMA owner and you've created your net land-based calculations, which means you've taken out those forests that are not commercial, those areas that are too steep, those areas that may be too close to water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you're left with your net land base. And that net land base, by law, I guess, needs to be harvested about once every 100 years. Okay, so 100% of the net land base, if you're going to be in compliance with the Alberta Provincial Government Forestry Act, is going to be logged once a rotation, which is about, depends on the forest type, let's say 90 to 110 years. So we're seeing, and this is not completely up to date, but you're seeing many of the cut blocks that have been cut on the landscape. And then of course we've got people and the urban landscape. So there's, Calgary and Turner Valley and Cochrane and all the other communities that are found in the watershed, including the hamlet of Bragg Creek. And then we get to see the bow wave of rural residential. So as the city grows, it pushes out the rural residential, it literally eats it. And so here we can see people that live in acreages. Industry, primarily in Calgary. The footprint of the hydrocarbon sector, the seismic lines, well sites, pipelines, processing plants, the mines, and almost all the mines are gravel mines. Because on average, every single person in this room, if you're an average Albertan, you're consuming 10 cubic meters of gravel per person every single year. That's the average. The water infrastructure, as we hold water back and then start to push it into irrigation systems just in the bottom part of the Upper Bow Basin. The recreation footprint, which is primarily golf courses. The trail network, a significant network inside of Calgary, and some cool stuff going on west of Bragg Creek, and then spread right through the Rockies. The road network, every land use requires roads, without exception. And so there's this road network, and you put it all together, in red, you see the direct footprint in the Upper Bow Basin. So if you want to know how many square kilometers they consume and who are the bigger players, there they are. So in this, over 3,300 square kilometers has been converted from natural habitat to a land use footprint so that we in this room can have the food and wood fiber and meals, vegetation, meat. The commodities that we need come from land uses, crops, pasture, cut blocks, rural residential, which exceeds all the urban footprint, roads, recreation, trails. And for the most part, it's growing at about 1.5% to 2.5% per year. Okay, so let's zoom into our landscape where we sit right now. Yes, we've got some crops and pasture and cut blocks. Urban, and sorry, you can't see it because I put a red dot on it, but it's right over top of us. The rural residential footprint of Bragg Creek, the mines, which are gravel mines, the footprint of the energy sector, recreation, the trails, the roads, all the linear footprints together, and then just add it all up in area. And it's pretty big. If I were to try and reconstruct it through time, it would look something like this. And the scale, the vertical scale I'm going to say it's relative political importance. And of course it was First Nations for way before that, and their influence is not as much as it used to be. Then we had a wave of trapping and market hunting. Forestry has been going on for well over a century and a half. Agriculture on the livestock side in this landscape, residential has become more important. And in recent years, we're seeing this exponential growth of the demand for recreation. So it's a combination of all these land uses, without exception creating significant benefits, but also fundamentally rewriting this landscape. So I want to move from the static part to the part about time, because I think it was a guy said the severely normal human. Well, the severely normal Albertan or human, I think, really struggles with the concept of time. As landscape ecologists, we call it Pauli's ratchet, which means we can detect a certain magnitude of change. So a 10% change, I can readily see. But if I'm walking through a year, 365 days, so that's 1 year, and something changes at 1.5%, 2%, most people can't even detect it. And so if you've been living on this landscape for 30 or 40 years, it just kind of gently changes. It's called Pauli's ratchet. I'd like to give an example. I haven't seen Guy for, how many years, Guy? A decade probably, right? So I'm out there, and he walks in, and he sees me, and the guy's a really polite guy. But I could see the shock in his eyes, because he hadn't seen me for quite a while. And I'd aged a lot. And so he saw the contrast. Like, this is what Brad looked like a decade ago. Here's what Brad looked like today. And, we got on to a nice conversation, and he was polite enough to say, oh my God, you haven't aged. So he saw meaningful time. Now, in contrast, pretty well every day I wake up with my wife, and she sees me every single day. And she's not noticing the facial decomposition because it's so gentle. But some guy Greenaway, I don't see him for a decade, and he goes, oh, what the hell happened, That is what we need to think about. So I'm going to try and show you meaningful time and land use history. And to do so, and I think it'd be helpful to think about, our lineages. So there's my grandfather, arrives in Alberta in 1905. My dad's born in 29. I come in the late 50s. Our daughter, Kate, is born in the early 1990s. And so it's worth thinking about how these landscapes have changed during their life. And so here we go. The 30s and the 40s. This is a heat map. Where it's red, there's lots. Where it's transparent, there's none. And it goes from green, very little, to red, a whole lot. This is the total footprint of the Upper Bow Basin over 4 generations. So then Kate has a baby, my granddaughter, and she's born last year. And so we can then simulate the change from Kate to Charlotte. And then the model is literally pushing the landscape into the future. And it's using the best available data on forestry and energy and agriculture and transportation. It's not modifying their business rules, just saying if they do what they say they're going to do, how's the landscape going to change? And so in 2010, we had 3,340 square kilometers. By 2060, we're up to 4,300. So things are changing. This landscape is not what it used to be. Now, having said that, anyone who just arrives here for the first time thinks it's wonderful, and it is. So it's an interesting perspective. So let's break that land use down into a bunch of the types. Here comes our croplands. And right there, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. You notice as the decades go on how the croplands disappear around Calgary? Well, because Calgary's expanded, right? And those croplands take a lot of water, at least some of them do. Okay, there's our crops. Let's look at forestry. And again, we talked about how the forest companies are by and large obligated with current rules to harvest 100% of the merchantable wood on their net land base once a rotation. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that the rules that they follow are good ones. In fact, I think for the most part, they do not address ecological goods and services the way they should. And there's a key conversation there, I think. So here's the basin, and let's see how our cut blocks arrived on this landscape. In the 1960s, 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010, 2020. And every time they come into our landscape, into our backyard, we get upset because we see the liabilities, and there are liabilities. And yet it's unfolding just the way it's supposed to, given the rules that have been set up for commercial logging. And if we don't move from, again, the more myopic, short-sighted, reactionary, tactical approach to actually being part of the conversation about how timber is allocated, and more importantly, how ecological goods and services are brought in, we're going to continue to be living that world. So here we're going to move into Bragg Creek, and we'll look at the same. You can see the cut blocks coming decade after decade, changing forest age class structure. Every cut block has to have a road to it, in-block roads. How are we managing those? How are we reclaiming them? How are they bumping into other land uses, such as recreation? So, none of these land uses can even exist, or would be required if we didn't have people. So let's start talking about that. So, let's take a look at the residential footprint, which is basically the same map as population, but let's let it grow decade by decade. See, has it started yet? I better start it. Oh, there we go. I'm going to run that one more time. Okay. 20s and 30s. Just slowing down. Maybe my computer's getting hot.